Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's look at the week's news agenda. I'm joined, as usual, by our senior fellows, Rafe, Heydel-Mankoo, of course, a royal broadcaster you've seen on GB News, and Kiszely, Dr. Philip Kiszely from Leeds University. We're going to be talking this week about, obviously, great events in Scotland and the departure of Nicola Sturgeon, also about the protests at Knowsley, and also look up some of those books that you've got on your shelves, because some of them might actually have already been featured in the Prevent anti-terrorism programme. But before we do that, I just wanted to send a message to you. We get hundreds, if not thousands, of comments on these shows, and I'm aware that quite often there are no answers to them. We don't appear to answer them. The reason for that, of course, is constraints of time. We just simply can't do it. However, we hugely appreciate the level of engagement actually that there is, and incredibly important, because it informs what we do and what we think for the next week. And similarly, people write letters. I've had 3 or 4 wonderful letters this week from people who see the New Culture Forum as, if you like, our own safe space, which of course it is, and we will be ramping that aspect of NCF up in the following year. But more to the point, when it comes to shows like this and the other ones we do, please keep on commenting, because we do read them, I can tell you. And I can tell you because last week someone said I looked thoroughly miserable and pissed off, and so I'm not, but I'm very sorry for appearing that way. But anyway, please do keep commenting. Well, our first comments are actually going to be about what's happened in Scotland and the departure, which had a very New Zealandy feel about it, Rafe. Is this important? You might say, well, of course it's important, but actually, how important?
I think this is fundamentally important for one of the key issues of our time, and that is the future of the union. And I think anyone who is a dyed-in-the-wool unionist, and I unashamedly am, will be happy to see the departure of Nicola Sturgeon, because the independence cause in Scotland was fueled almost entirely by the charisma of Alex Salmond and of Nicola Sturgeon. And like her or loathe her, she was supremely impressive as a communicator and as a campaigner. And she had an ability to connect with people. Amongst current politicians, only Boris Johnson had that similar ability. Now, whilst she's despised by many down in the south, her popularity ratings, even now, even after all the gender reform troubles that she experienced, are still higher than any other political leader in this country. And the loss of her, there is no other person in Scottish politics today in the SNP who can come anywhere close to her levels of support or her skill and ability to motivate the nationalist side. So actually, it does look as if, for another generation, the independence question will actually have been settled. It's not going to be the pressing cause that it may have been had she carried on. And of course, when you consider the impact of that Johnson had in Scotland, when you think of the loathing of the Tory party, if it couldn't be achieved, then when you've got a Labour government obviously coming at the next election, I would say the impetus for independence will be detracted even more. The other implication which affects people in England is the fact that with the SNP gone, not gone I should say, but with support for the SNP inevitably going to plummet over the next few months and years, where will those SNP voters go? And it seems inevitable that they'll go primarily to the Labour Party, who will already take votes away from the Scottish Conservative Party, which means the chances of a landslide victory for Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom have gone up exponentially, by the virtue of the departure of Nicola Sturgeon. And of course, then we can also discuss, well, I'll let Philip go on to it. Nicola Sturgeon's story is one also of go woke, go broke on the biggest possible level.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I agree with everything you say, Rafe. But actually, as well, her story is one of abysmal failure. I mean, the Scottish NHS, the economy, and actually independence, But the male rapists in female prisons was the thing that brought her down. And this is a time where we've got this temporary kind of respite, and we can say, all right, we can celebrate because reality seems to have trumped fantasy, doesn't it? Here, you know, the idea that biological male rapists shouldn't be in female prisons has won the day. Okay, fair enough. That's reality trumping fantasy. But I'm thinking, how long will that last? And if this debate was 2 years hence, 2 years further down the line, would that still happen? You know, I'm just wondering, because the young people I speak to, actually, they prefer fantasy to reality, you know, because they're drenched in identity politics. And that seems to be inexorably the direction we're going in.
And that's really been, I think, the story of the SNP over the past decade, is this fantasy and the ability and ideology combining, and the ability they've had to somehow hoodwink the Scottish population, who have returned them at election after election with stonking majorities.
But actually, this is what you get with single issue things, isn't it? You know, when everybody is obsessed with this one single issue, which is independence, they push in through the back door all of this authoritarian, radically left-wing
agenda. Yeah, I mean, look at it. You've got the most draconian free speech laws in Europe. You had this outrageous gender recognition bill going forward. You've had appalling levels of drug abuse, which makes Scotland the pariah of Europe in terms of what's happened there. Alcoholism on the rise over the last decade to high levels. Terribly underperforming schools. The achievement levels between rich and poor children wider than ever before, and a failing NHS, and a debt ratio which would make them into a tin pot little country, bankrupt banana case. And yet the Scottish public keep voting them back in. This ideology has made them blind to all of the actual failings of the SNP.
But I think when you say hoodwink, though, you see, Rafe, I mean, I think we've talked about this briefly on the show before. Could it be that the Scots themselves have changed? I mean, that they're not being hoodwinked, but they've actually changed, that they are more supportive of much of this agenda?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason is that the SNP have managed to sell Scotland as being a small country like the Scandinavian states, which everyone equates with progressive politics. So you think of Iceland and you think of Denmark, and not on immigration issues, but of course famously it's very easy for the SNP to lecture Westminster about immigration, given that there are hardly any immigrants at all in Scotland, and there's always areas with low immigration that have the most tolerant policies when it comes to migration. But the thing I think people in England sometimes don't realise is how vast the cultural takeover of Scotland was by nationalists, because most of the media outlets are also nationalist. And so if you read the newspapers there, you get a very different take on the Scottish government than you do if you take a more impartial view from the south.
Yeah. Actually, what was quite interesting, so I don't know whether you felt this, but what I think, you were saying about the people taken by this independence thing. I found that the Scottish reaction to the death of the Queen surprised everybody. I don't know whether you remember seeing those crowds that came out. It was quite extraordinary, because this thing is also going up that they don't care about. In fact, the monarchy is this symbol of imperial, But I mean, could you take anything from that at all?
I think there's just such a huge disconnect between two things. Between the Scottish political scene and ordinary people, and two, the Scottish political scene online and ordinary people. So if you go back to the independence referendum, they, online, they thought they'd won it. They completely thought they'd won it, didn't they? And then they got, what was it, 8%? It was a big percentage, wasn't it? I can't remember what it was, but it was that. So that's one thing. And then with the royal family, that's another one. And then if you think about the gender stuff, that's another one. So it's people cleaving to this one single idea despite all the rest of these other things. And actually, there is probably more that brings us together with Scotland in terms of England and Scotland than separates us, I would suggest. And that's a really good example of what you say. I think the politics and real life are completely at odds with each other.
I mean, I would say the Queen's great last gift to the Union was actually dying in Scotland.
Yes. Yeah.
Because everything is, most of the plans for the funeral, everything had been predicated on Her Majesty dying in England or Windsor, at Sandringham, wherever it would be. And by dying in Scotland, she reminded them that she is also Queen of Scots. And you saw all of these ceremonies taking place at St Giles Cathedral, all of these places which people don't really think about, but the royal presence in Scotland became more visible than ever before. I also think it was a bit of a shame that they flew Her Majesty's coffin down to England rather than going on the royal train down the spine of England,
which
where
just
you would have
been
had
superb.
scenes like a Churchill's
Yeah.
funeral, people
Yeah.
lining, and that would have been sort of the last journey of Her Majesty. But I think that was a really important. And then we saugh the King, of course.
Yes.
As soon as he acceded to the throne,
First
he went to
place.
Wales,
Yeah.
went to Northern Ireland, went to Scotland, reminding them that actually he is the king of all four nations.
The Queen's connection with Scotland and Balmoral in particular, that connection, it isn't there with Wales, isn't it? And Wales is being kind of Scotland light, isn't it, with its far left radical agenda and all the rest of those things. But it didn't have that connection with the Queen and specifically Balmoral. So that kind of separates it. And for me, Scotland is much closer in that respect.
I was actually thinking, sorry, but in terms of culture wars and things, I was just thinking about this yesterday. You know, America always now sees Trump's election as being the great fissure, the great fracture that really visibly divided the two sides. In Britain, we say it was the Brexit vote that really divided, and everyone can trace their division. But actually, it started in Scotland with the 2014 referendum, and you are either a yes or a no. And these fracturings within families and all of the turmoil we've seen since seems to have come from these two referendums in these islands.
It's interesting because, you know, when you think of the Westminster bubble, talking about Nicola Sturgeon, there is this kind of admiration. You know, she's looked at as a politician, but as you said, she was wrong virtually about everything. But in fact, she was sort of admired simply for her political skill. You know, and therefore you find yourself having to take notice of someone who's therefore admired for the way she's dealt with something. You know, I thought what was fascinating was actually seeing the way in which she sort of crumbled, even just purely in terms of semantics, when it came to defending this gender recognition Scotland bill.
Well, because it's you can't defend it. I mean, that's one thing. I think the other thing with Nicola Sturgeon was that she had just superb timing. When did she come into office? Was it 2014? I think it was.
15,
was it 2015? Okay, that's the time when all of this stuff really went on steroids, isn't it? And when her kind of politician became very popular, and I don't necessarily just mean popular in the country, but I mean popular with the civil service, and she was very much representative of that idea of what a politician is and what the civil service is, actually what the establishment is.
And her problem, of course, was the fact that she was so tied to ideology, to two ideologies, the ideology of nationalism and the ideology of identity politics. And all her critics will say, even her friends of hers will say, once she has tied her colours to a mast, nothing will divert her from that. And that's why she ended up in this position. And like, as with Boris Johnson, great communicator, great campaigner, but not great at governing, and also not good at political strategy. And so it wasn't just the woke issue, it was also the fact that her idea of how to achieve independence was disapproved of by about half of the SNP, who she couldn't bring on side, by trying to make the next election actually a de facto referendum. Those were the issues, and no one could divert her from that. And then you just saw the reality of that over the gender issue being being tied in knots by journalists by trying to explain.
There's one interview in particular which I looked at yesterday, and there was just a question. It was almost like the Paxman thing, you know, just reiterating this question: is this, you know, is a trans woman a woman? No, it's this person is a rapist. No, is this person a woman? No, you know, and all of those things, and just this kind of slipperiness. And in that, I wonder if we could maybe put it in the comments for the on YouTube, because it just shows her disintegrating on the spot. I don't know whether you've seen it, but it's just fascinating to watch.
And make no mistake, it wasn't just the SNP supporting this Gender Recognition Act, it was also the Labour Party and the Lib Dems and the Green Party. It was only the Tory Party in Scotland that didn't support it.
That's a really good point, actually, because we talk a lot about Keir Starmer not being able to define what a woman is. We talk about the Green Party. Actually, the Lib Dems get a free pass on this, and they're probably the worst in this respect, I would
Although
imagine.
actually, in terms of popular support, it was definitely not there for the Scottish public, was it?
No.
That's my point. So you had a majority of the Scottish Parliament being in favour of it, and a majority of the Scottish population not being in favour of it, much as we saw it in 2016-17 with the British Parliament versus the British population as a whole.
It's this disconnect that I've talked about. It works on every level, and it goes as deep as you want
But
to go.
I think the woke issue has actually scuttled independence.
Yeah.
Because I think Nicola Sturgeon realised the way she'd alienated Scottish nationalists over the gender issue meant that the hopes of getting support for independence, support for the SNP to push through independence, also declined. So in a weird way, the woke agenda has killed off the independence movement.
Actually, speaking of woke, do you see any parallels, because there have been drawn, between what happened in New Zealand, you know, with Jacinda, what's her name? Jacinda Ardern. And also, I read in The Spectator, Patrick O'Flynn wrote a piece saying, oh, it's going to be Justin Trudeau next.
Yeah.
Now, wait a minute, what do these have in common? What do they have in common? I mean, they're all the most woke and also actually the most authoritarian when it came to COVID.
They're the most authoritarian. That's the thing that they have in common.
All
The
done
woke
with a
stuff
kind of
comes
smile.
from that, yeah.
You know?
A very toothy smile in New Zealand.
Well, and Trudeau is in trouble. I mean, it's a minority government, I believe, at the moment there, and he's only there by the grace of the National NDP party in Canada. But yes, I think Nicola Sturgeon was inspired a bit by Jacinda, by this idea of go before you're pushed out, and at least leave with some people at least thinking, oh, he's done a great job, when you get a round of applause on the way out.
There's nothing left in the tank. The tank was empty years ago.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it, that the one conservative thing that this government has done, I would say, was when the Prime Minister put a block on this gender bill in the UK and for England. So far as I can see, he's got no particular support for that, has he?
No credit for that, yeah.
No credit.
I mean, this is what's remarkable, though. You know, this is where you see how bad Nicola Sturgeon's strategy was, because she thought we're going to artificially create a culture war with the Tory party. You know, Sunak didn't want to do this, and he was almost apologetically saying, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm going to have to strike this down.
It was courting her, wasn't it?
It banned with our Equalities Act, and Nicola Sturgeon said, no, this shows you the anti-democratic, thinking the public would be on her side, and it turned out Scotland's left-wing population had more in common with the Conservative Party in Westminster and Rishi Sunak than they did with and that, I think that was when the writing was really on the wall.
When you get somebody who is so dominant like she is, all the other possible contenders fade into the background, if there are any. Are there any in Scotland? Who's going to take over?
Well, I was just reading Casey Balls in The Spectator today, and she said there is no heir apparent at the moment. You know, one of the reasons is because I don't think actually people expected it. You know, I'm surprised that they didn't after the male rapists in female prisons. I expected it to go sooner actually. But the SNP didn't apparently expect it, so I can't think of anybody. No.
Yeah, you've got John Swinney. You've got
John Swinney, who's got lots of experience. But
one of the front runners is a woman who was actually a very devout Scottish Presbyterian, and the question was, well, how? Oh, and she, for her convenience, has been on maternity leave during the whole gender issue. But they say, how could the woke agenda be advanced with her? Because she obviously holds traditional values.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting to see. But nobody has anywhere near the level of recognition or approval that Nicola Sturgeon had, which is why I think this is a golden chance for the Union to actually reclaim territory.
And as well, don't underestimate their kind of potential to be total charlatans. You know, they might just dump the woke agenda if it doesn't work. You know, they might just do that without
Is there
her.
any recorded evidence of that in history ever so far? I mean, my concern, you see, it's a very fair point. Is that it actually will make no difference to the woke agenda. This is a kind of triumph. You know, of course it is. It's reality, you know, colliding with ideology, but that it's so embedded that actually people will still not quite see it for what it is. You know, which is a total, you know, rout of the whole ideology, but that somehow it will still be blessed. I mean, I don't know. What was interesting about her, at least amongst English people, was that she did inspire just such irritation, didn't she? And hatred, in fact, you know.
And lots of great satire as well.
Loads of satire.
I thought she was Fan Dabby Dozy myself, but
honestly, the memes going
or Tran Dabby Dozy, whichever you want to say, I don't know.
No, I mean, there's no getting away from it. Anyway, as you say, there is a kind of break. Obviously, a huge disconnect between elites, if you like, and the government and people, which we are seeing in our second subject tonight, which is the protests at Knowsley outside Liverpool. The most recent news on that is that there's now been some form of curfew that's been imposed on it. But, it is extraordinary, is it not, how, the actual sort of way in which these things can be reported is in fact getting narrower and narrower and narrower. I remember at a time, I'm sure you do too, where basically it would be reported there were some extremist elements in the crowd who were there just basically clambering on board. That's all gone. Now it's far right, What is, by the way, with the curfew? Do you know what this entails? It's been put on the, it's been on.
I think it's by 9:30 p.m.
Yes.
that all the asylum seekers have to be back inside their hotel.
Right, but the thing is that the whole way in which it's being reported is that these are the put upon people, and that the people outside are just.
Yes, it's for their protection. Yeah. Although I'm sure many young women will be quite happy that they'll be.
Well, let's just think about how this started. It was a young 15-year-old girl from Liverpool, wasn't it, who was being harassed by an asylum someone in the hotel, and she filmed it. And she said, "Look, you can't do this in this country." And I think there were one or two other instances of harassment and sexual kind of that kind of stuff. And then it was reported in The Guardian, and it was, far right mob goes berserk. And I read it and I couldn't believe it. We're talking, this is Liverpool here. There aren't any far right people in Liverpool. There are plenty of far left people, but these are just ordinary local people worried about their children. That was it. And what's happened is, it's like you say, Peter, there were some extreme elements. Now, far right has taken over the narrative, hasn't it? And Jeremy Corbyn was throwing it about. Everybody throws it about. Now, I don't know what it means. I know what extreme right means, and I know what radical right means, and I know what centre right means, because political scientists use those phrases to kind of determine, particular kinds of shades of political ideology. But far right just means anything. It's a slur, isn't it? And if those people are far right, then we're far right, and then everybody's far right who is actually slightly patriotic, who knows anything about the culture, and who champions the culture. It really is as simple as that. One of the things that really worries me is that, and I'll make a prediction here, actually, I think this far right term is going to go into the official vocabulary. So we've got decolonisation. No, we've got decolonisation at the moment.
I think it already is, along with white supremacy.
Well, I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about policy, right? So decolonisation's in the policy vocabulary, and education. And I think that idea of decentering Western culture is going to turn into a panic, and Western culture will be seen as a far right culture in policy and education. And that means,
you mean in the mainstream?
In the mainstream. I actually mean
it's already underway. It's already underway.
Yeah, but at the moment, certainly in education and policy, it's decolonising. I think it's the tone is going to become more febrile. That's what I'm going to say.
I think getting back to these protests as well. Even if that girl, the video hadn't been taken by that girl of being harassed by, I would think that people have a right to protest about the fact of the asylum seekers being in a hotel. Even before you get to the point of actually what they might be doing. I think that more people should do it. I wish more people would do it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that I found remarkable at the time, firstly, you've got to put this into context, because this video was just the most tame and minor of a whole series of incidents, which included one sex offender, a migrant, started putting a knife and slitting a young boy's throat.
Oh, God.
It includes, we've had stories of migrant students in a school gang raping a girl in school.
Afghans, yeah.
Of Afghans, yeah. We've had lots of these stories coming out. So it's on the basis of all of that, and also people seeing their already deprived town centre declining even further because of the presence of these young, men of fighting age. Let's remember who we're dealing with primarily. And it's funny, you know, because this stems from the same sort of political correctness that we saw with the Rotherham grooming gangs or the rape gangs there. It's this desire to blame the victims and focus all attention on what happened on the vigilantes, let's say, rather than actually on the cause of all of this. Now, when you had the
classic leftist strategy,
when you had the black riots in 2011, if you remember, in Tottenham and elsewhere, what were the media saying? Not that these were extremists, they were saying these are people with a grievance. And so if you read The Guardian, people were trying to explain why these protests were happening. Why were these cars burning? They were explaining that. Here we have another situation where people are living in deprived circumstances, living with their own grievances, and yet what happens when they set fire to a police van? Oh, well, these are all far-right extremists. No one's condoning the setting fire to that, but the mere presence of people protesting over genuine concerns and genuine fears, suddenly this tolerant, bleeding heart liberal left turn a blind eye.
And the first question we should ask ourselves, actually, is what on earth is a hotel full of migrants doing in Knowsley? You know, it's probably the last place, or one of the last places where that should be. Maybe it should be in Hampstead.
Well, no, that's the point I was going to make. I think what should happen is like what Ron DeSantis did, you know, and also Texas as well, I think they did, and that is to basically ship many of these people to Islington or to the home counties, or because.
You know, they did do it at Camp David as well in America.
Yes. But they and Martha's Vineyard.
Martha's Vineyard. Yeah.
But basically, you know, send it to the areas where there is actually not especially left wing, but very soft attitudes to this whole thing, simply because they don't come into contact with the results of it. So that's where you should go. Could you imagine if they took over a hotel, for example, in the Golden Triangle of Gloucestershire, the Cotswolds? Can you imagine the amount of protests there'd be then? You know. By the way, I should add earlier. Sorry, this just occurred to me. When I was saying earlier about I think more people should do it, I didn't mean burning police cars.
Oh, yeah,
sure. No, of course
just
you
make
did.
that short. You know, I mean protesting. I think, you know, I think people have shown remarkable restraint about this. You know, and frankly, they will get no credit. On a wider point, which we've already sort of alluded to, what worries me about this far right thing is a general bubbling away sense in which conservative thought or sentiments, however mild, are gradually being made, you know, just unacceptable.
Yeah.
I don't just mean in you know, but you say it's not actually in the mainstream policy yet, but it's kind of getting there.
Well, it kind of is. I mean, it is. If decolonisation is the centerpin of everything, then anything conservative is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And I come across that every day, and I would imagine if you're a right-leaning, or philosophical conservative civil servant, for example, then you know you would have real stories to tell there. I think it's the case now. The point I was trying to make is that the language, the vocabulary will become more fevered, and if it's frowned upon now, and I mean, how do these things work? They actually work. There are core celeb things, and people get cancelled and all the rest of it, but that's not really how it works, is it? It works through committee. Okay, so if you're a right-leaning philosophical conservative, and you're in an institution or you're in education or anything like that, committees are just going to block everything you do. That's how it works at the moment. But I think it's going to get, as I say, much more febrile, much more.
Well,
difficult.
Actually, I mean, that's interesting. That brings us on. This whole discussion brings us on to what I wanted to talk about, which is that we talked last week about Prevent. You know, there's been a report out which has been done by William Shawcross into Prevent, which is the anti-radicalization program set up by, I think it was set up in the 2000s. The point was it was actually set up quite specifically to deal with Islamic radicalization. Douglas Murray wrote a great piece actually in The Spectator this week, where he talks about the fact that actually it's, should we say, it's certainly spread its wings. I can tell this
to put it mildly. Yeah.
Yes, it's spread its wings, become obsessive with about far right and all the rest of it. He also talks here, and I do want to read it out because it's very. He talks here that last weekend. This is Douglas Murray in The Spectator. last weekend the press reported on an analysis done by Prevent's Research, Information and Communications Unit. And this analysis looked into social media users described as, quote, actively patriotic and proud, right? And basically it looked at various kind of markers that you could look out for in the case of books, for example. And he sort of talks here, for example, he says he was quoted, you know, he appears in this set of markers that, you know, show that someone's being radicalized. Also Peter Hitchens, Melanie Phillips, you know, and so it goes on, but also other books as well, such as Civilization by Kenneth Clark, you know, and in rather a jokey way maybe, Great British Railway Journeys. I mean, if you watch that, you know, with Portillo, you know. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, and also 1984. You know, that's rich in irony, isn't it? So these are the kind of titles which sort of suggest to the people who run Prevent that you've got to maybe keep an eye out. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
But there's more to it than that, because if you read further down, it's people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, all the great English philosophers who are empiricists, who are classical liberals. Yeah. You know, John Locke is a classical liberal, now defined as far right. And I think it's a recategorization of that idea of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. All of those things are just far right, and the authoritarians just want to shut it down.
Yeah, then that's the ultimate goal here, right? Because by deeming them to be far right, you make them off limits. Yeah. And once things go off limits, eventually they fall out of national and collective memory. Yeah.
And these are the building blocks of British culture.
And so you're wiping out those parts of our culture and history, which leaves you with a sort of a post-communist sort of year zero. But it's quite remarkable. I mean, in the thick of it, Douglas cites as one of the things which makes you far right. Now, Yanandu Anucci, who wrote in the thick of it, is one of the archetypal left-leaning, anti-Tory, metropolitan intellectuals you could find. You know, and if you watch Great British Railway Journeys, which I quite enjoy watching, they're inevitably going to see some suffragette museum, or they're going to a slavery site, and then, you know, the wokery is certainly present in some form or another. And of course,
Portillo's gone all over the continent and the subcontinent,
and he's been to India and everywhere. Yeah. Exactly. It's quite remarkable.
But actually, I have to say, I'm not sure whether it was Prevent, but when I was at the Assembly, we were given these presentations by people, you know, in the police and the special services and all of it. And one I remember, because I had a big to do with the Green Party leader at the time, sitting opposite. We were shown this thing, and there were these flashpoint words that came up, and one which was showing, you should be careful, is if someone says ban the burqa. And so I said at the time, this seems a perfectly reasonable point of view, not saying you have to agree, but it's us. And she immediately outright, that's right, you know, basically accusations of bigotry and all of that. But the thing is, ban the burqa, you know, you should, you know, what are we talking about here? I mean, this is a completely reasonable, it's one that I would support, actually. You know,
Switzerland had an issue with this. We know in France it was a very hot topic, which the French government, being a secularist government, taking pride in enforcing secularism. This is hardly a beyond the fringe discussion to be had. Same thing in Denmark and elsewhere.
I think on a broader level, just looking at what's happening, and I've said this before, but it almost feels like we're living in a great house that is Britain, and all of the beautiful antique furniture, all of our culture is being shipped out of it and thrown in a skip, and it's being replaced with flat pack IKEA crap. In other words, identity politics, you know, theory, and that's where we are. So, you know, we can laugh at it and we can kind of sneer at it, but it's really frightening.
It's fine. Yeah, you know, just to go back to the previous conversation about the far right and so forth. Yesterday, I jumped into a black cab, and as I opened the door, I heard the sounds of the mass bands of the Royal Marines playing out from this very, very patriotic cabby.
Oh, well, there you got it.
And I got in the back, and he was telling me about his own YouTube channel, and he said he's raising money for charity for the 10th anniversary of Lee Rigby's death, for Lee Rigby's son.
Fantastic.
And I just thought, you know, it's always in cabs that I have the last decent conversations I have with people in London. But I just remembered at that time. Do you remember what was said by the media at the time about the two murderers? That this was a mental health issue. That they were mentally ill, and it's always the case when you're dealing with Islamic extremists. But when you're dealing with people on the right, then it's definitely terrorism.
It's terrorism.
It's never mental health issues. You never heard Joe Clark's murderer being described as mentally ill, did you?
Actually, I probably, this is just speculation, but I would say that somebody who made a fuss about the anniversary of the death of Lee Rigby, which was actually quite recent, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
They would probably be on this radar, that it's enough actually to talk about Lee Rigby. Do you know, I remember, because I was living in Woolwich at the time, and it happened 500 yards away. It happened in top of Wellington Street, right? Yeah. This was in 2013, I believe.
Yeah, May 2013.
And I remember at the time, the media came on en masse, but there were thousands of people up there. There were thousands of people looking at the flowers that had been left. And the media were trying to interview people, and so many people would not be interviewed. Yeah. And even then, you know, this is long before Brexit, all of this stuff, you could tell that they already knew they were going to be stitched up. Yeah. You know, I thought it was very, very telling. And, you know, and I remember a big group of Sikhs arrived to pay their respects, which was charming. However, they just went for them, you know, to interview them, you know. All the other people didn't want to really know. I think it's extraordinary.
I think it's that particular time. It was what I was saying about Nicola Sturgeon, wasn't it? You know, when she became First Minister. I know it was a year or two later, but it's that round about that time when it really took off and when it really became on steroids. And I think that now you say anything. I mean, my God. The abuse we get, which is quite funny. You know, I get called gammon pretty much every day on Twitter. It's great. You know, it's great.
Do you get any personal abuse?
Oh yes, all the time. Yeah. I thought it was funny. You know, when Nicola Sturgeon was resigning, you had a whole segment on Newsnight talking about the misogyny. You know? I thought, when do you ever hear about the abuse men get? If you're portly, whatever, people always mention, you know, but we suffer silently. You know, we don't yell misandry here, you know, or any of this. But somehow, if you're a woman, suddenly it's far
laughing
worse.
Behind the camera.
It's true, but that's not an encouragement to come forward.
It's extraordinary to think people feel they can say how personal they can be.
Oh yeah, but even, I mean, you know, I was just thinking today as I was coming through London. I've travelled through most European capital cities, but as what would I be described as by them? A cis, able-bodied, heterosexual, white, You don't
able-bodied.
Just about. You don't see any of that culture on my journey from King's Cross to here. It's expunged completely.
Oh, you mean like in ads and things?
Yeah,
and everything?
it's like,
oh,
have you noticed that?
Yes,
it's like I just don't exist at all.
Yes, exactly. It's like it's like coming into Heathrow, you get an entirely different picture. If you just look at the ads.
But my point is, if you go to any other, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but if you go to any other capital city in Europe, you'll see their culture, you know, and you'll see representations of men in their culture as well.
I think we're going to get a few phone calls from Prevent, actually.
I hope so.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. Thanks, Rafe. And thank you for watching. By the way, I should mention, if you're still watching, that we have a new program called Deprogrammed, which has just gone out yesterday, first one. Do give it a look, won't you? Harrison Pitt, Rollo Pignol, and Poppy Coburn presenting. Well worth looking at. We shall see you next week, and keep the comments coming, won't you? Thank you. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.